When a racetrack stable hand was killed in Florida, her friends noticed that her death was eerily similar to one in New York, but that woman had supposedly taken her own life. It would take an exhumed body and some cowboy boots to find the truth, but it might have been too late. This is the story of Robert Earl Hayes, the man who was acquitted for a crime that he probably did really do. Hi friends, I'm Katie, and this is Katie Does Crime. Thank you for joining me for the first time if you're new here. I'm a Midwesterner who now lives in New York City, putting my writing degree to use by researching true crime cases that interest me, and hopefully you. And hello to the usual rapscallions and reprobates. Please consider subscribing or joining me on Patreon if you'd like to hear more true crime stories. Today's case is one of those where I read a few articles about it and I was like, what in the actual? The guy was convicted, he was acquitted, now they think he actually did it, but he can't be retried? I knew I wasn't going to get it until I actually sat down and wrote out the timeline, and now let's see if I can talk about it in a way that actually makes sense. When Pamela Albertson was killed, her death was announced with 2 sentences in the local paper. It didn't say that she died tragically, just that she was gone. It didn't even say that she left behind 2 children, a teenager and a 3-year-old. The 32-year-old was found murdered at the horse stable where she worked as a groom or a stable hand in Pompano Beach, Florida. It was February 20th, 1990, and she was supposed to be reunited with her kids in only 3 days. She'd left them with relatives in Ohio. And then she was strangled in the dorm room she was staying in at the Pompano harness track before she ever saw them again. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm sorry that there's literally only this one terrible photo of Pamela. Her family hasn't wanted to speak to the media, so I think they're just private people, which I respect. Police soon arrested 26-year-old Robert Earl Hayes, and it sounds to me like it was thanks to witnesses who pointed a finger at him. Hayes had worked at the same stable at the racetrack from November 1989 to January 1990, and during that time, people said he harassed and threatened Pamela, and that she made it clear that she wasn't remotely interested, that she, quote-unquote, wanted nothing to do with him. But like other men who can't take no as a complete sentence, being rejected only made him more aggressive toward her. He was eventually fired from the stable and went to work at another one, still at the same racetrack though. Pamela was afraid of him. And it seemed like she wasn't alone. In the previous 3 years, Hayes was accused of attacking women near racetracks in New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. 2 of the cases never made it to court after the women decided to drop the charges, and he only got probation in a 3rd case. His lawyers said the first 2 cases were dropped because they were weak, which is not exactly the same thing as saying the guy was innocent. The police definitely didn't think so. As they investigated Pamela's death, friends of hers asked them to take a second look at another similar case out of Oneida County, New York. In August 1987, 38-year-old Leslie Dickinson had also been a stable hand at a racetrack, and she had also died in her dormitory at the Vernon Downs Raceway. And wouldn't you know it, Hayes, who traveled in the harness racing circuit as a stable hand, also worked there at the time. He had been questioned briefly when Leslie died, but her death was eventually ruled self-inflicted, a hanging with an electrical cord. The weird thing is that there wasn't even really any room in her tiny, primitive dorm room for a hanging. There was a shelf in the corner that she had supposedly used. A shelf. Her family said she loved life and would have never taken her own, but Oxygen.com reports that she suffered from depression as a teenager and tried to end things then. She spent several months in a hospital following an attempt at the age of 15. And 2 days before she died, her boyfriend had just left town for a new job, which could have certainly given her a reason to feel depressed. But her coworkers said she was in the best of spirits the day she died and had just taken her paycheck and bought groceries. Hardly something you would do if you were about to take your own life. But the police just couldn't find anything to go on at the time that made her death seem suspicious. As of August 1990, Hayes was sitting in the Broward County Jail in Florida for Pamela's murder, but hadn't been charged in Leslie's death. His lawyer, obviously a real stand-up guy who sought justice at all turns, asked why they would want to go poking around in an old case like Leslie's. He said they had a suspect and were now looking for a crime. But a Pompano Beach detective said that in interviews with the women who knew Hayes, there was a pattern of unwanted sexual advances, violence, and choking. Leslie's case was reopened, and by November 1990, authorities were working to have her body exhumed for further investigation. In December, the Daily Sentinel reported that Leslie's body had been exhumed and a second autopsy performed. Her death was now being investigated as homicide. I'm not really sure how the cut to her neck with an electric knife and blows to her head had been explained away as self-inflicted the first time around. But police said that things they learned from the later interviews with other women who knew Hayes helped form a more complete picture for this autopsy. Suddenly, wounds on Leslie's cheek and the backs of her hands seemed very likely to be defensive, like she had been fighting for her life. It also turns out that when her body was found, it's because someone reported a fire in her dorm at the racetrack. As an investigator went back through his notes, he realized that the person who reported it was Hayes. In October 1991, Hayes was still being looked at for Leslie's murder in New York, while he was convicted of first-degree murder in Pamela's case in Florida. The prosecutor told the jury that Hayes had been harassing Pamela, trying to date her, telling her he was going to have sex with her, but she wanted nothing to do with him. So he caught her at her racetrack dorm and tried to assault her. When she screamed, he strangled her. Hayes said he had an alibi for the time when Pamela would have been killed, but witnesses said they actually saw him at her door, and she was telling him he couldn't come in. Hayes changed his story to fit the eyewitness accounts, and he said that he had consensual relations with Pamela 2 or 3 months earlier. But the jury wasn't buying it. They recommended 10-2 that he die in the electric chair, and the judge agreed. The South Florida Sun-Sentinel printed a picture of Hayes sticking out his tongue at the judge before his sentencing in June 1992. It took until 2003 for him to be charged with Leslie's murder, and the DA worried that there wasn't going to be enough to convict. Yes, Hayes had been the one to report the fire in her dorm. Yes, he had even been telling people that he killed her. He said to one person that he had to kill her after she spit in his face. Other groomers said he would start talking about committing the murder when he drank one too many. But the thing that really sealed his fate is that Hayes was known for his cowboy boots. An Oxygen article called them fancy, which I hoped meant that they were like, rhinestone studded and pink. But then I saw the police photos, and it turns out that they were sadly just black. Anyway, on the night that he reported the fire that led to Leslie's body being discovered, he was barefoot when he talked to officers. There wasn't much left from the crime scene. The evidence had been thrown out when her death was ruled self-inflicted, but the remaining photos showed those fancy boots of his outside Leslie's room. I don't know if I find it polite or disgusting that he took off his shoes before coming inside to kill her. On what would have been Leslie's 56th birthday, realizing that he was caught, Hayes pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the first degree, burglary, and attempted arson in exchange for a plea deal. He said he was smoking crack at the racetrack and decided to go ask Leslie for some money he had seen on her refrigerator. When he reached for it, she slapped his hand, and he reached back and punched her so hard he thought she must be dead. Without even checking, he cut her wrists and neck and staged the hanging with the electrical cord. Then he started the fire and left. Hayes was given 15 to 45 years in prison and will be eligible for parole in the case of Leslie's murder in New York in June 2025. Now, here's the thing. As I mentioned, Hayes was sentenced to death for Pamela's murder in Florida in 1991. He appealed in June 1992, citing 4 issues in his trial, such as hearsay being allowed on the stand. And in 1995, 4 years after his conviction, Hayes actually won his appeal from the Florida Supreme Court. His case was the first in the state to use a certain kind of DNA testing technique called band shifting, and on appeal, the court called it unreliable. So Hayes got a retrial in 1997, and this time that DNA evidence wasn't permitted. And the defense developed a new theory about another stable hand who worked with both Pamela and Leslie before each of them died. This guy had given police one alibi in 1990, but under cross-examination in 1997, he contradicted himself. It also didn't help that he was serving time in prison at that moment for kidnapping and assaulting 2 other women. So with the doubt introduced by this new suspect, Hayes was found not guilty of killing Pamela this time. And I guess he eventually thought, hey, let's go one step further. His lawyers at the Innocence Project of New York figured that new DNA testing would completely exonerate Hayes and maybe help out in his other case. Hairs had been found in Pamela's hand when she died, and they thought those hairs wouldn't belong to Hayes since they were thought to be from a white person. And that other suspect presented at Hayes' retrial, the one who gave contradicting alibis, was white. So the thought was that if these hairs could be tested, they'd prove that the white guy was indeed the killer and Hayes was a good guy after all. DNA testing had been in its infancy when Pamela died, so the hairs had never been sent to a lab. In late 2020, the Innocence Project picked a lab and submitted the evidence. But when the results came back in 2022, the DNA testing actually showed that the hairs belonged to Pamela herself, so nothing really conclusive about Hayes. But investigators also went ahead and retested vaginal DNA collected from Pamela, and wouldn't you know it, that was found to match Hayes. So basically, the now 61-year-old was guilty all along. I liked the New York Times headline. They hoped a DNA test would clear him. It did the opposite. The only problem is that since he was acquitted in Pamela's murder decades ago, he can't be retried for the same thing. So the Broward County State's attorney said he'll ask the New York Parole Board to keep Hayes in custody when he's up for release later this year. His lawyer says that we already know he had sex with Pamela, so it's not surprising that his DNA was found on her swab. The only thing is that Hayes himself admitted that they were intimate months before she died, so his sample wouldn't have been lingering when her autopsy was performed. I'm like, guys, good for you for trying, but give it up. The really interesting thing about this case to me is that a play and then a movie were made about wrongfully convicted people called The Exonerated that included Hayes' story. Awkward. As always, please let me know what you think about this case in the comments. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm just a true crime fan like you are, and I really appreciate you taking a chance on me. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you liked spending this time together. I would be so appreciative. Until next time, I'm Katie, and this has been Katie Does Crime.